Looks like a few people are still connecting. Okay, well, I'll get things started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Adam Goodheart, director of the Starr Center at Washington College, and I am thrilled to welcome all of you to this Starr Center program with historian Jill Ogline Titus, talking about her book, Gettysburg, 1963. It's always exciting to welcome a historian of this caliber and achievement and creativity to a Starr Center program, but it's especially a thrill to welcome this particular historian because, as many of you know, Jill Titus was an integral part of our team at the Starr Center at Washington College for many years. She was the associate director of the Starr Center from 2007 to 2012. She also received her PhD in public history at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And she's the author of a previous book, which is called Brown's Battleground, and is about the struggle for school desegregation in the wake of the Brown v. Board of Education decision in Prince Edward County, Virginia in the 1960s. Jill, while she was at the Starr Center, she was really one of the most gifted and remarkable and dedicated public historians I've ever had the opportunity to work with. There are so many wonderful things that I could say about Jill. I could talk about what an amazing researcher she is, both archivally and the oral history that she does. I could talk about the fact that she's a wonderful writer. She's a great collaborative colleague to have on the team. But I think most of all, Jill really cares about people, and she brings that to everything that she does. She brings that to her teaching, but she also brings it to her work as a public historian. She thinks about how these conversations about the past can make a real difference in people's lives in the present. She understands that history can be a space for advancing causes of social justice and civil rights. She also understands that history can become a battleground for fighting over those same issues. And surely it's no accident that her first book was called Brown's Battleground, and her second book is literally about a battleground, a place that was a battleground literally in 1863, and also metaphorically for centuries afterwards, as she shows. Jill, while she was at the Starr Center, was just amazing in the way that she was able to make connections to the broader community of Kent County and the Eastern Shore. And so many of the things that we do day in and day out at the Starr Center today, especially with things like the Chesapeake Heartland project, really grow out of the work that Jill did, the connections that she made, the relationships that she built, and inspiration that she had while she was with us at the Starr Center. So we are proud to be associated with her, and we were very sad on the day in 2012 that she told us that she was going to be leaving us for Gettysburg. And before starting the conversation with Jill, just to sort of take you back to that day. So here is Jill Ogline Titus, and she's a very gifted historian of 20th century America. And she's a very gifted historian of race and civil rights in America. And she tells me that she is leaving Washington College, leaving the Starr Center, which broke my heart. And she says she is going to become the associate director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. And so here is Jill going to the most famous 19th century American history site anywhere. And here is, as a historian of 20th century America, and here is Jill as a historian of race going to a historic site that's traditionally been presented as a site about white people fighting white people. So in some ways it was a surprising transition, and Jill, I wonder if you could start out by talking about what it was like for you as a historian of the 20th century to arrive at this famous 19th century site.
Absolutely. Well, Adam, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm so glad this is being recorded so I can go back to it when I need a pep talk. That was absolutely so kind. And it's wonderful to be here with you today. It's wonderful to see some really familiar names. I only wish that I could be there in person to catch up with some of you, but I'm so excited to do this. And I joked that the Starr Center, of course, is devoted to the entirety of American history, but has that certain focus on the 18th century. The Civil War Institute has that certain focus on the 19th century. I've told everyone I worked with that I'm getting closer and closer to my own century. Somewhere I'm going to find a center that focuses primarily on 20th century history. But it was, yes, coming to Gettysburg College was a definite transition. I have always approached the battlefield as a 20th century historian, in addition to as a public historian. In the ways that I have used the battlefield as a classroom and used the battlefield to sort of inspire my own work as a historian, I've certainly focused largely on the commemorative landscape and how the physical landscape in front of us reflects generations of ideas about the past and generations of ideas about what is significant about the Battle of Gettysburg, why it was fought, and why it matters. And not only how those interpretations have changed over time, but how they, in and of themselves, were always contested, even in their own time. If you look at monuments or memorial architecture on the battlefield from the same era, they are not all going to portray the same story. Many could actually be diametrically opposed to each other. So it's fitting that this project for me actually started out on the battlefield. I was living at the time when we first moved to Gettysburg on Seminary Ridge, which is, I think, perhaps the best place in the country to watch the sunset. It's absolutely gorgeous. And I would go for walks along Seminary Ridge and the part of the ridge that's known as West Confederate Avenue in the evenings. And West Confederate Avenue is a part of the battlefield that runs along what were the lines of the Army of Northern Virginia on July 2nd and July 3rd. And that's where the majority of Confederate monuments are located. Almost all of those monuments are mid to late 20th century in origin. And as I walked the battlefield and looked at those monuments and pondered the inscriptions and, went around to the back and got down on my hands and knees to find the dedication date or what I could find about the sculptor or who was on the commission that placed the monument, and then went back into the archives and went back into the newspapers to find what I could learn about those dedication ceremonies, the more it became obvious to me that these monuments were about the civil rights movement and about the Cold War as much as they were about memorializing the men who fought at Gettysburg. They are artifacts of their own age, and they're a window into how the story of Gettysburg was used to help this country fight the Cold War and used as a prism for wrestling with the question of what was the Civil War about and what did the Civil War have to do with race? And what does it tell us about what we as a nation in the middle of the 20th century ought to be doing about race and civil rights? So that became so obvious to me, yet there were so few markers on the landscape that could make those stories come to life for anybody else. And that's really what led me to this book. At first, I thought this book was just about the monuments, but it turned out that the monuments were just an entry point into the story of Gettysburg in the mid-20th century and its role as an icon in the fight over civil rights and the fight to determine the United States' place in the world in that mid-century, and to a place where the meaning of the Gettysburg Address in a world that was locked in this battle between, communism and capitalism could be put to use to mean something and could shape a nation's foreign policy and could shape the way that people around the world perhaps even thought about the United States. So it started with me walking on the ridge at sunset, looking at these monuments, and then it became something much bigger.
So can you set the scene for us? Your book is Gettysburg, 1963, and the subtitle is Civil Rights, Cold War Politics, and Historical Memory in America's Most Famous Small Town. So can you set the scene for us of this small town and what it was like in 1963, but maybe also set the scene for us, and it looks like there's some students here with us, people who don't remember 1963 or may need a little bit of a refresher on what was going on in the country and the world at that moment that had to be Gettysburg.
Sure. So Gettysburg itself in many ways is quite similar to the community that it is today. In the 1960s, it was a small town in an agricultural region, about 97% white, but with an African American community who had been here since the early 19th century. The community, in addition to agriculture, was very much dependent on tourism. The 1950s and 60s were a time in which, automobile tourism was rising to new levels, and American families were traveling in family units for vacations in ways that they really had not before, when most visitors to Gettysburg, came on trains or came on special railroad cars chartered for veterans or chartered for regimental associations. By the mid 20th century, families were visiting in cars, and they needed hotels, and they needed gas stations, and they needed entertainment, and their children needed activities that weren't connected to the battlefield. And so all sorts of commercial establishments began springing up, which is not to say that there weren't some from the day after the battle. There were, but there was a real mushrooming of this in the 50s. And this unleashed a pretty unpleasant preservation battle, where there was a lot of debate over how lands in this historical community ought to be used. To what extent should they be providing tourist amenities? To what extent should they be providing entertainment? And to what extent should they be preserved in the state that they were, or as close as possible to the state that they were in 1963? So you had a community where many residents were actually descendants of the people who had lived here in July of 1863. And when they thought about the Civil War and they thought about the battle, they thought in very personal, very family terms. You had a community for whom the battlefield was the backyard, a place to go sledding in the winter, a place to take walks and have picnics, but also a community for whom the legacy of the Civil War and the rituals of Civil War commemoration were really central to who they were, both psychologically and economically. In terms of and I would say that in some ways that was all of that. In some ways, much of that was true for the community's African American population as well. The rituals of Civil War commemoration were a big part of the lives and of their lives and the rhythms of their community as well, although they were different in some ways than the rituals that the 97% of the community that was white followed. But that idea of the battlefield as a backyard, the battlefield as a recreational landscape, that was also very much true for African American residents. I should also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna ask you, because I want to make sure that we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I know folks are going to be having questions of their own. But before we sort of go to that national level, or maybe as a way of getting into the national level, it seems to come so naturally to us right now in 2022 to think of debates about the Civil War as a kind of way for civil rights questions to be litigated in our society, with what we've seen over the past few years that all of us remember. But was that something that people were thinking about consciously in 1963? Were people consciously going in and saying, the way that we decide to commemorate the Battle of Gettysburg is going to be all about our contemporary discussions about race and memory and civil rights in America? Or was it something that develop differently?
I think the answer is yes and no to that. I think that many people were aware of the freighted political significance and were actively, consciously seeking to use Gettysburg to send a message about what needed to happen on the civil rights front. At the same time, however, I think there were many individuals for whom remembering the war and commemorating the war operated on a smaller personal scale. And the idea of this being politicized or this being inherently connected to current debates was something that they was something that they resisted or tried to keep at a distance. It's certainly true that the town's African American community always had a sense that this history, this association of the community with the high water mark of the Confederacy and with the ideals of the Gettysburg Address was deeply ironic given the level of segregation and discrimination in Gettysburg. And many members of that community frequently used the ideals of the Gettysburg Address, and by the 1960s used the knowledge that Gettysburg would be very much in the international spotlight as a springboard for arguing for civil rights reform and for pointing out that the hypocrisy of discrimination in Gettysburg. It's interesting, during the New Deal, one of the work relief programs that was most popular during the New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which took young men and put them to work on public service projects. And a lot of CCC units served in national parks, and they did more than almost any other group to reinvent national parks for the automobile age of tourism. At Gettysburg, there were multiple camps of CCC workers. And for most of the time, they were African American. That was very unpopular with local residents. There was a lot of complaining to the local congressman, get these men out of here. There's going to be a race riot. There's going to be a race war. We don't want these young Black men here. But then there was a Department of Interior official who looked at Gettysburg, despite all those complaints, despite all that arguing, and said, not only is this the place where we should, for the first time, appoint Black officers to lead a Black CCC camp, but we should also appoint a Black archaeologist to work in an intellectual position with this organization in Gettysburg to do archaeology, to be a community leader. And when there was pushback from the Army and from the Park Service and from lots of other places, his response was, by God, this war has already been fought. And if we have to fight it again, we should do it right here in Gettysburg. So I think that to a certain extent, the idea of that symbolism and that connection has always been there.
Well, okay, so tell us, to get back to that sort of the national front, as it were. So you talk about the civil rights movement, rather, and you talk about the Cold War. So what was specifically going on in each of those stories at that moment that people were gathering in Gettysburg to celebrate or commemorate the 100th anniversary of this great battle?
Quite a lot. The summer of 1963 was a very active time on the civil rights front. I mean, the summer opened with the mass demonstrations in Birmingham, the use of fire hoses and police dogs against children, the assassination of Medgar Evers, an NAACP leader, in his driveway in full view of his wife and children, with a very firm statement on the part of African heads of state saying that continuing racial discrimination and violence like what was seen in Birmingham would seriously jeopardize the US's relationship with nations across the continent of Africa. And George Wallace, staging his big confrontation in Tuscaloosa over the desegregation of the University of Alabama, the segregation now, to get standing in the schoolhouse door. that's what was happening just a few weeks before people gathered to commemorate Gettysburg. And many of the ceremonial speeches, events, monument dedications, all either explicitly or implicitly referenced the legislation that the Kennedy administration had sent to Congress in the wake of Birmingham, in the wake of Wallace's confrontation, the Civil Rights Bill. It was before Congress in the summer of 1963, and just a few weeks before the battle anniversary, Kennedy had put his support behind it and sent it off. There were, I couldn't even count the number of allusions in the over the course of the battle anniversary in particular to that legislation. Everything from speakers arguing that fulfilling Lincoln's new birth of freedom meant passing that legislation immediately, to speakers who made the case that the federal government had overstepped its bounds, that it had become a totalitarian power like the Soviet Union, that the Civil Rights Bill was just another example of that grasping power, and that freedom-loving Americans needed to stand with the Deep South in pushing back that legislation.
Yeah, there are so many interesting moments that you pull out in your book, and one that interests me is LBJ's visit and his speech. And of course, this is about 6 months before he became president. He was still Kennedy's vice president at the time. But tell us about his visit and the speech that he decided to give.
Yes. So LBJ was invited to give the formal address at the annual Memorial Day ceremony, which is a big deal in Gettysburg. It's held in the National Cemetery. And because it was the anniversary year, the committee set their sights really high and invited the Vice President of the United States. And Johnson was very hesitant to do this. He was not in a good mental position at that time. Yet his secretary made the case to him that if he were to go to Gettysburg and say something memorable and meaningful, it could be his own Gettysburg address, and he could separate his legacy from the legacy of John F. Kennedy. And so LBJ came to Gettysburg having decided that he was going to talk about civil rights. He had sort of said earlier, well, if I talk about it, they're going to say I'm an opportunist. If I don't talk about it, the press is going to scream at me for, ignoring the elephant in the room. Whatever I do, it's going to be wrong. But ultimately, he concluded that he was going to make a strong statement about civil rights. And essentially, what he did was to give a speech in which he openly acknowledged the indictment that Martin Luther King Jr. had laid out against the nation in his letter from a Birmingham jail, which had just been published a few weeks earlier, that being moderate is in many cases worse than being an overt obstructionist, and that African Americans have been asked to wait and wait and wait and wait, and waiting means never, and there can be no more waiting, and there can be no more cooling off, and that to continue to call for balance or patience is to cast your lot with the obstructionists. And so it's interesting, in this speech, Johnson never mentions King. He never says he's talking about Birmingham. He never says he's talking about that he is responding to this letter. But if you are familiar with the letter and know the context of what had happened in the United States in May of 1963, there is no way that you can miss that explicit response. So what he says is essentially, we can't ask Black Americans to wait anymore. It's empty, it's hollow. Change has to come now. And if we as a nation don't change, we are jeopardizing our standing in the eyes of the world, and we're jeopardizing all of the previous generations who have fought for freedom, and we're going to throw it away because of racism, essentially. But he then goes on. Remember, Johnson is, of course, a mainstream politician, and he's not a civil rights activist. So he then goes on to sort of outline what he sees as appropriate forms of protest: the ballot box, the courtroom. He's cautioning people that street protest can be volatile, that street protest can be dangerous, that this can cause, this can bring further criticism from people around the world. And he clearly has this May statement on the part of African heads of state in mind about that. So he tries to impose limits on appropriate protest, which is very much what he goes on to do as president, despite his enormous and I think very genuine support for the civil rights movement. He also was frantic to control it and direct it and keep it, within the bounds of what he considered appropriate protest. But this speech is one that Johnson is proud of for the rest of his life. It's his first major statement on civil rights. He sends copies of this speech to people for the rest of his life. Some of the ideas get reused in the voting rights address 2 years later. And some historians say that Johnson's willingness to say publicly that civil rights was a moral issue helped prod Kennedy to finally do that a couple of weeks later. I even found some really interesting newspaper articles where that were making the case of, why can a descendant of Confederate soldiers, a Southerner, say this? And this Massachusetts Congress, this Massachusetts Congress, and Kennedy, who's theoretically the descendant of abolitionists, he can't say it. Why is that? And of course, that reveals some problematic ideas about racial attitudes North and South. But yeah, it's clear that this speech, it does play a role.
And so interesting to me when you talk about that as LBJ's Gettysburg Address moment, because of course, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, you're talking about LBJ framing civil rights in the context of global politics and global power. And of course, we think about Lincoln's speech as defining a sort of a new America, a new sort of role of civil rights in the United States. But of course, it starts out with 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent, situating America in this sort of global way, and then ends with the word shall not perish from the earth. And we know Lincoln was very, very concerned with the impact that the outcome of the Civil War was going to have globally and with the sort of global historical mission of the United States. So it's just so interesting to me the way that crops up again in 1963, just as it did in 1863.
Yes, and one of the most interesting programs, I think, to take place during the anniversary year was a panel on the international aspects of the Gettysburg Address that took place in November of 1963, or the anniversary of the address, and it was headlined by the Secretary of State, and there were representatives from the European nations who had representatives at Gettysburg in 1863 who spoke. And one of the things that Dean Rusk, who's Secretary of State at the time, said was that he saw the Gettysburg Address as the starting point of American foreign policy, that American support for democracy and hesitancy when working with empires or imperialists came from the Gettysburg Address, that American interest and focus and support for self-government came from the Gettysburg Address, that that commitment to representative democracy across the globe came from the Gettysburg Address. And he did acknowledge that people rightfully point to our own failings and our own inability to live up to the full meaning of self-government at home. And they are right to point this out, and they are right to hold our feet to the fire, but we are improving and we are changing, and we invite you, the rest of the world, the nations of the world, to partner with us in this new century of global progress, which of course in his definition means in standing against the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure that other folks have a chance to ask questions, and so I would invite people to type questions in the chat or to start raising their hands. And we have a comment from Pat Nugent, Deputy Director of the Starr Center, who says, as someone who was assigned letter from Birmingham jail and many a course, I'm so happy to know about LBJ's 1963 speech. I'm thinking about it as a companion reading assignment. And that's wonderful to know that this event is already having that generative effect. And one of my few regrets about my time as director of the Starr Center is that Jill and Pat didn't have a chance to overlap with one another, because they just remind me of one another in so many lovely ways, and their concerns do, and their attitude as public historians does. So I'm glad there's this intersection between the two of you, part of a larger conversation that can happen here. Jill, I wonder if you have anything to add to respond to Pat's comment.
I have used those two in tandem together, and they are wonderful. And sometimes I also add in a third document, which is also specific to Gettysburg, an address given by a Florida congressman at the dedication of a monument to Florida troops during the 1963 battle anniversary, which is it's a fascinating look into the mind of another white Southerner who is very focused on foreign policy and very concerned about the impact of demonstrations on the nation's reputation abroad, but who is less supportive of the movement in general than Johnson, a congressman who actually voted against the Civil Rights Bill when it came up, but nonetheless made this eloquent argument about how we cannot hope to win the battle from the hearts and minds of people around the world if we show them by our actions that democracy and dignity are reserved only for the white man in this country. So and who also goes on to lay out some very stringent limits on what's appropriate protest and what's inappropriate protest, but those three together make a wonderful comparative assignment.
Jill, it looks like we've got some other questions coming in, but before I turn to some of those, now you arrived at Gettysburg in 2012, which in retrospect seems like an innocent and peaceful time compared to 2020 or 2021 or 2022. So of course, in recent years, we've seen memory of the Civil War become an incredibly fierce battleground for talking about contemporary America. So I wonder, first of all, in what ways is that, monument debate, as some people call it for short, playing itself out currently at Gettysburg, whereas you say there are a lot of monuments to the Confederacy that were put up at a very different time. So how is that playing itself out in contemporary debates at Gettysburg, or contemporary actions and activism at Gettysburg? But also, how did that influence your book as this sort of unfolded around you while you were researching and writing it?
Yes. Well, there's been a push for years from some of my colleagues here at the college, from historians around the country, from individuals within the National Park Service to do more to contextualize the monuments, to do more to help visitors understand the context in which they were erected and the reasons that they were placed there, and the way that they and the role that they have played in continuing to fight the battle. Some of those efforts have been in place for years, but are just now starting to bear fruition. The Park Service has placed interpretive waysides at several of at several spots around the battlefield, connected to sort of key parts of the commemorative landscape. And the plan is to have those contextual waysides in front of all of the 20th century Confederate monuments on West Confederate Avenue. I have only half seriously sort of pushed for taking it a step beyond interpretive waysides and going for, public art or kind of innovative displays of, shooting footage of civil rights protesters, marching in Charleston, South Carolina, across the front of the South Carolina Monument at night to, spark debate and conversation. Like I say, I'm only sort of half serious about that.
It sounds totally serious. We're considering a really serious, I mean, for real.
I think it's a really good idea, but working closely with the NPS, know all of the reasons why, why it can't be done. But over the last 5 years, there has been an emerging sense among certain individuals on the far right side of the political spectrum that the Confederate monuments at Gettysburg are in danger and need to be protected, protected with arms, protected with guns. There have been multiple open carry gatherings on the Gettysburg battlefield to defend the monuments, which have been extraordinarily scary and upsetting for local people, for many visitors who stumble into this without understanding what is going on. There have been a couple of heated confrontations between those individuals and either counter protesters or visitors or local people who choose to confront them or who choose to give a different interpretation. I have a colleague here in the history department, Scott Hancock, who for years has been attending commemorative events at the battlefield with contextual signage, asking people to consider the bigger picture, asking people to remember the cause for which the Confederacy was fighting, asking people to think about the connections between slavery and the Confederate government. And for the first few years of that, I think most of the responses he got were just kind of perplexed looks or people just thinking, wow, that guy's crazy. In recent years, he's gotten both more individuals who have embraced that and chosen to go out with him and stand with him, and also more overt hostility and threats. And he has an enormous amount of courage. And I have so much admiration for the way that he puts himself out there and frankly puts himself in danger to encourage people to think more deeply and to question their assumptions. So there is no plan in place for these monuments to be removed. They are artifacts. They are part of Gettysburg National Military Park. Any decision to remove Confederate monuments on a national military park would have to come from Congress. It's not something that the National Park Service can decide or legislate. But like I said, there are some very productive efforts in place to better contextualize and to help people understand the complicated meaning of these pieces and the extent to which they are not history. They are interpretations of history, certain privileged interpretations of history. And I applaud efforts that have gone beyond focusing just on the Confederate monuments to remind us that all of these monuments are that. All of these monuments had political meanings. All of these monuments, well, most of these monuments have some element of controversy, and we shouldn't focus just on the Confederate monuments as problematic and assume that, oh, all the Union monuments, there's nothing more we need to see there. There's nothing we need to investigate. There's nothing we need to challenge ourselves on. No, there's a lot there as well.
But it reminds me almost of the way that, this sleepy little American town of Gettysburg suddenly in the summer of 1863 was engulfed in a national conflagration. It must have felt that way just a few years ago. I'm thinking about your colleague, Pete Carmichael, the director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg. And I was following his postings on social media. We're Facebook friends and as well as non-Facebook friends, but I was looking at him actually out there, like physically confronting these guys who were waving Confederate flags and who were armed and who were standing there. And I mean, it was incredibly physically brave thing of Pete to do. And academic historians were not always known for our sort of physical courage like that, and going out and confronting armed opponents. So anyway, it was really a remarkable moment, and you must have had your own moments like that at the time.
I have, and a few years ago, I was at I was with the counter protesters at a pro-Confederate flag rally out at the Eternal Peace Light Monument. That was, I don't even remember what year it was. It was at the height of the time that the controversy was focused specifically on the flag. I guess that was 2016, 2017. And that was a very difficult and challenging experience. And I both felt like I should be there and that I shouldn't be there at the same time. And I've had some very interesting conversations with Pete and Scott. Pete was with Scott that day in July of 2020 about what they experienced that day. I wasn't there that day. I've been out at other times, but yes, I mean, that's really what I had in mind when I said at the end of the conclusion to the book that Gettysburg continues to be this place where so many ideas and experiences and movements converge, and where we battle over what it is that we are as a nation and who we want to be and who we think we are. And I don't see that changing. I think Gettysburg, for better or worse, will continue to play that role in American history. And I think as a historian that it's very important that we have places that play that role. As somebody who loves this community and loves the people who live here, though, I also see the cost of that for day-to-day life in this community.
We have a question from Derek Katzum, who is asking you about the responses of the white citizens councils, they're often called, those far-right anti-integration organizations, and sort of how they were responding to this moment. And I wonder if you could also talk about the other side and what African Americans were saying in 1963 about this moment and this commemoration. So maybe you could cover both.
Sure. Well, to answer the question about the citizens councils, I'll use George Wallace as the example, as the spokesperson. Wallace was here for the battle anniversary in July. It was just a few weeks after the Stand in the Schoolhouse Door speech. And when I interviewed members of they were young at the time, they were teenagers or so, but members of the Black community, the local Black community. And I asked, did you know Wallace was here? The response that I repeatedly got was, no, we had no idea he was going to be here. If we had known, we would have been out there, with signs. There was a lot going on here the first week of July, and Wallace is present. He didn't decide to come until super late, and it sort of got buried. But he was out and about, and he got a ton of attention from the media. He was the only visiting governor to be interviewed by the local newspaper, in addition to every other newspaper covering the event, sort of following him. People embraced him. People trailed him around the battlefield. Governor Wallace, sign my program, sign my hand, sign my reproduction kepi. And Wallace openly talked about how he saw the Confederate cause as sort of iconically American, that everything that was essential to the American character was embodied in the Confederate cause. And then made the leap to the nation today, has abandoned those principles and is sliding toward, destructive centralization. So he and others who shared his mindset made the argument that Confederates were organic anti-communists, that Confederates were defenders of the nation, defenders of the Constitution, and as such, they were entitled to equal space on all of the nation's battlefields for their interpretations of the war. At this time, there were still a fairly small number of Confederate monuments at Gettysburg, because for decades, Gettysburg had been a Union exclusive memorial park. You could not put Confederate monuments here. So that, that argument and that willingness to directly connect the Confederate cause with anti-civil rights rhetoric was very prevalent. All of the arguments that the Civil Rights Bill ought to be rejected, that the federal government was trampling on the powers of the states and was trampling on the rights of individual business owners to make their own decisions about who they're going to serve. All of that was very explicitly kind of using the Confederate cause to justify massive resistance in the present. On the other hand, African Americans from the earliest days of the centennial had been very peeved, rightfully so, at the extent to which many centennial programs were sort of a celebration of just, martial masculinity, and we're all Americans, and brother shot brother, but now we're a lot stronger, and that didn't in any way acknowledge what the Civil War was about, why it was fought, what its greatest legacy was. It didn't acknowledge emancipation, and had pushed back on that strenuously from the very beginning. But the last thing I'll say about that is that as the summer of 1963 got closer and closer, there were a lot of concerns that the depth of segregation and discrimination in southeastern Pennsylvania would be on display before the world. It was well known that only in the preceding 2 years or so had African Americans generally been able to get service in most local restaurants or hotels. There were still many places that were sort of untested or just generally perceived to be off limits. So, discrimination in employment, discrimination in housing were endemic issues in Gettysburg. So the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission actually came in the spring of 1963, and they visited all business owners, and they said, we just want to remind you that Pennsylvania has a public accommodations law, and you're required to follow it. And here's the notice that you need to put in your window. And this is very focused on trying to prevent incidents that would put the United States, in a bad light, and could be circulated around the globe as an example. Oh, look, even in Gettysburg, the entire nation is racist. Even in Gettysburg, look what happens. There were Black families who came for the commemoration. It's hard to know, from outside the community. It's hard to pinpoint the exact numbers, but there was a Black pastor in Gettysburg who was asked by a bunch of local businessmen in, I think, June, do you think there are going to be demonstrations? Do you think they're going to be protesters? Do you think we're going to be embarrassed, in front of the world? And his response was, well, I think it might depend on to what extent, people of color find a welcome here, and to what extent they're humiliated. Like just a few weeks after that, and a few weeks after the Human Relations Commission launched this big effort to remind, business owners of the law, the mayor of Gettysburg, in his official sort of welcome proclamation to all visitors who would come over the course of the anniversary year, he made a very specific statement about how everybody will be served in the restaurants and the hotels and everywhere as quickly and as courteously as possible. That's clearly an outgrowth of concern about demonstrations. It was believed that if demonstrations would happen, they would be on July 3rd during the commemoration of Pickett's charge. And there was a lot of tension and worry and nervousness on the part of the planners that morning. We were sort of looking around everywhere. Do you see anyone who looks like they might be going to protest? And a formal protest did not happen. Although, like I said, from what my interviewees told me, if they had known George Wallace was here, that very likely could have been the thing that would have led them from the position that most local Black residents took, which was, well, we'll see how much you care about the eyes of the world, and we'll see what concessions you're going to make, and we're going to see how far reform goes, and we'll keep our cards close to our chest, and if we don't feel that we need to protest, we won't, but we'll make you very aware of the fact that we could. But if they had known Wallace would be here, that might have led people to take that additional step.
But that response is so interesting, of sort of making sure that Gettysburg wasn't going to be embarrassed by appearing to be segregated and discriminatory. And you might say that was emblematic of what the United States as a whole was doing, or certainly trying to do in 1963, was to sort of just integrate enough as to not appear to be embarrassing on the world stage, but actually really not change power relations in a significant and lasting way. At least that's where a lot of the people in the national white political establishment were. So it seems like Gettysburg was a microcosm for that in so many ways.
Absolutely. And also a microcosm for white Northerners' culpability in discrimination and segregation, while at the same time saying that only Southerners do these things and that the North is free and clear. There were many local business owners argued that it wasn't that they were prejudiced. They would hire African Americans. They would welcome African American clients or patrons. It was just that this was a tourist community that depended on white Southerners' pockets, and they were prejudiced. So the fact that Gettysburg follows this color line, it's not because we want to. I mean, we're a Northern community. It's because of those white Southerners, and we just do it because we have to keep their dollars coming, which is I'm losing my word, but it's a smokescreen.
Yeah. Well, I would invite anybody to raise their hand if they have any questions or comments at this point, or to type something in the chat. Okay. Well, if nobody else has a question, I'll ask you something that can maybe take us towards wrapping up, which is, what lessons are there from 1963 for how we commemorate, talk about, engage with history in 2022, and maybe Civil War history, or maybe history more broadly, as we think about the way that we can treat a really complicated and difficult past in ways that will be not just inclusive, but progressive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think one part is to be inclusive, to seek out the different voices, to respect the different voices, to listen to the different voices, to not be so committed to one narrative that we're blinded to the existence of other meaningful narratives. I think of the first executive director of the Civil War Centennial Commission, which was the federal body overseeing commemorative activities, who, when a newspaper reporter asked him how they were going to commemorate emancipation, got super flustered and basically said, well, we're not going to commemorate emancipation. We have other important themes that we're going to follow on. And by the way, did you know that, lots of Black people were very content in the Old South, and they loved their lives. And like, wow, okay. But I think that's one lesson. I think another lesson is that we need to take seriously the weight of these narratives and the political power that they have assumed over the years, and to not retreat behind our shell of, well, this is history and we can't change it, but to say, no, this is the way interpretations of history become privileged and become ways and narratives that legitimize marginalizing certain groups, and that legitimize, power and privilege and prestige at the extent of the good of others. And then also, I do think one more maybe positive thing that we can take from the centennial, and it's certainly something that I think an idea that many people have awakened to in the past few years, is that history matters, and that what we believe about the past and what we tell ourselves about who we are and how we came to be deeply influences how we act in the present and the society that we create. And that history, I mean, I'm a history nerd. I have been from the age of 4. I love history because it's fascinating. I love history because it has always been inherently interesting to me. And that's all well and good, but that's not enough. I think we also need to think about the usability of history and how we can rely on it and draw on it to inspire ourselves to create a more just future, while at the same time recognizing that when we open the door to the usability of history, we also open the door to people crafting usability narratives that we will vehemently disagree with. So somehow we have to figure out how we help people understand that not all interpretations of the past are equally valid. They might be equally heartfelt or equally passionate or equally connected to, a belief that this is going to help us do something in the present, but they're not all equally valid. Some are built on facts and source materials and a sensitive understanding of the complexities of the past, and others are not.
Well, if I were called upon to dedicate a monument to Jill Ogline Titus on the Gettysburg,
Heaven help us.
I think the description I would put on it would be "History Matters." That just encapsulates so much of what you do in your work, and speaks to why the work that you do matters so much. And anyway, I'm excited and proud to be here with you tonight, and excited and proud when I think of your association with the Starr Center and what you've gone on to achieve since then, and will achieve, because it looks like you've got another book in the pipeline as well, that takes this to a new chapter.
It's very early and very rough, and I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I hope I will.
Tell us super quick what your new project is.
Well, my new project, in a way, is actually my old project. It was the project that I thought I was going to be doing before this one sort of, burst in front of me in a ray of light and said, "Hey, I'm your project, do me." But the project that I am very slowly chipping away at is an outgrowth of my first book, Brown's Battleground. And it looks at efforts to relocate Black high school students from the South into Northern and Midwestern communities during the 1960s on the assumption that they'll get a better education and it'll open the doors for further educational opportunity for them. And I'm very interested in the way that the students themselves and the communities thought about geography and the history of race in the United States, and thought about how segregation and discrimination functioned. Many of these communities were dealing with, these host communities were dealing with their own thorny civil rights issues, mostly relating to housing segregation and employment discrimination and employment. And for some, going south and getting a Black high school student from Mississippi and plunking them down in their school that had 3 Black students, but 10 miles over the school was nearly all Black, was sort of a way of assuaging their own guilt and feeling that they were contributing to the civil rights movement without actually tackling the issues in their own community. And yet at the same time, I know that the students had very different concerns and different experiences and different perceptions. And I'd like to delve into that more.
Great. We have a comment from Anita Gottlieb saying, in the 1960s, Norfolk, Virginia public school textbooks described how slaves played fiddles and dances and were happy. A friend was teaching in a Black elementary school and showed it to me. I took it to a Black House of Delegates member who had it removed from the school. And again, it's sort of what's old is new again when we think about just the ways that today people are trying to litigate the way that history is taught, and to see a more inclusive history as being somehow a deep mortal threat to our children and to our nation. So Jill, just keep doing the great work that you're doing, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a great night.